En sus roles de High Level Climate Action Champions de COP25 y COP26, Gonzalo Muñoz y Nigel son los encargados de movilizar la acción climática entre los actores que no son estatales. En enero de 2021, si no es ahora, ¿cuándo? Desde Dubái vamos a saludar a Gonzalo Muñoz, COP25, junto a Nigel, COP26. Queremos darle la bienvenida, los aplaudimos desde el ámbito virtual y el ámbito presencial también. Bienvenido Gonzalo, bienvenido Nigel, adelante con su intervención.
Buenos días a todas y todos. Quiero, por supuesto, comenzar esta presentación agradeciendo a IRADE como organizadores de este gran encuentro y, por supuesto, felicitarlos por su visión al escoger temas que son globales, urgentes y son los temas que necesitamos para hablar del futuro. En especial me gustaría, por supuesto, enviar un saludo al directorio de IRADE y en especial a su presidente Rodrigo Briceño, y también quiero aprovechar de saludar al equipo de Gulliver, quienes realizaron el nexo, y por supuesto aprovecho de felicitarlos por el fabuloso trabajo en ecosistemas de colaboración extrema que llevan a cabo en la región y en todo el país. De hecho, recomiendo a todos leer el fabuloso libro que acaba de publicar Leo Maldonado al respecto. Hoy estamos en el Biobío, una región industrial que está definitivamente avanzando en materia de sostenibilidad. Se trata de una región que está con planes incipientes, pero con mesas público-privadas para el desarrollo del hidrógeno verde, por ejemplo. Y hay otras iniciativas que buscan comprometer a la región con la acción climática. El llamado en ese sentido hoy es que pongamos el pie en el acelerador y le demos a esos compromisos metas sumamente concretas, como las que exigimos hoy en nuestra campaña Race to Zero, de la cual vamos a hablar. Se acabó el tiempo en que invitábamos al walk the talk. Llegó el momento del run the talk, como dice mi partner Daniel Bercelli. Nigel, what would you say about it?
Well, first of all, it's great to be talking to a business audience in an industrial region. I mean, you know my background in manufacturing, and I think that sometimes the world gets overexcited about digital, as though we could live in a fantasy digital world. So I think industrial regions are the ones who are going to drive the transformation in the physical economy that's needed. I also, Gonzalo, if you'll allow me, given this is a Chilean audience, I wanted to just shout out you personally for you've handed the baton on to me, and I've run alongside you with great joy. I think what you've done is you've brought the voice and the power and the dynamism of the private sector into the global process, and we know that that's needed, right? Yes. Businesses are causing the problem, if you like, because we're all asking businesses to give us cheap energy, cheap transport, but the business and the dynamism of business is what will deliver the solutions, and you've really brought that in, and it's been great to feel that dynamism. I think the other thing that you've done is you've brought the voice and the leadership of Chile into a global conversation, which is so often dominated by G20 countries. Or G7 countries or G2 countries, right? And I think what Chile has shown in its leadership, and you've really represented that all around the world, is the dynamism of a global South emerging economy that is taking the challenge of the climate crisis really seriously, and that is running the walk, as you say. So, because I thought it might be helpful if you actually explain a little bit to the audience what is the history. Why do I say that you've brought something new? What's the history of the climate champions? Where's it come from, and how did we get here?
Well, thanks so much, my friend, for those words. And definitely, I think for the audience, it's important to understand that, first, that we are going through a major crisis that we need to solve urgently, and that for many years we were relying on the role of the nations, right? We expected that the nations will coordinate globally through the mechanisms that they have set at the United Nations level, and then that would be it, right? Well, reality is that they already reached the needed agreement back in 2015 at the 21st COP in Paris, and they not only reached this agreement, in that particular agreement, for the first time, they formally recognized that when it comes to implementing the agreement, they need the private sector as well as the subnational governments. So that was something that was very particular from the Paris Agreement, and that meant that they created an area at the United Nations taking this into account. It's the Global Climate Action Agenda, and they ask for the future presidencies of COP. COP is a system that takes the lead on climate from one country to the other, going around 5 major regions of the world. And then every year since Paris, the country that takes the presidency has to also name a high-level climate action champion to mobilize all the climate action coming from cities, regions, businesses, investors, civil society, all of them towards, of course, a zero and resilient carbon world. So that's our role as high-level climate action champions. We work 2 by 2. That's why we're working now together with Nigel, with this particular privilege of having had 1 extra year due to COVID to work together, and hopefully in that year we'll see now in Glasgow making a good difference in terms of using that extra time, right? But the most important thing is that we're here to rally non-state actors and to better connect the work of those non-state actors with their national governments, expecting to activate the ambition loop, right? When you see, and if we as non-state actors, we as business sector, business leaders, we recognize that there is now a framework called the Paris Agreement, then we can say, okay, it's time to evolve, it's time to move ahead. And when we do that, we send the message to the national government for them to say, okay, these guys are doing the work, let's increase the ambition when it comes to national policies, right? So that's the idea of what we need to move to activate regionally, but also globally. The first 4 high-level champions, France, Morocco, Fiji, and Poland, they did great stuff in terms of creating some structure in the process, and they were politicians, right? The particularity of this moment is that for the first time, we have 2 champions coming from the private sector. Nigel had a great experience for years in the automotive industry, then running CDP and running Women Business. So we know a lot about how the business sector, how the financial institutions, even when it comes to implementing, we know quite well the local government, how they operate, right? So the first year, my first year, 2019, working in that case with the Polish high-level champion, was mostly about setting the right levels of ambition. It was about accepting, validating, and embracing the IPCC report of 2018, when the science told us, like, we need to go towards that 1.5 degree as the best window of opportunity, meaning that in order to get there, we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the very, very latest, and we need to halve our emissions in this decade. So that gave us certain goals, very particular goals that we embedded into the work of the champions, and that's how we started putting together the biggest coalitions of the world around the 1.5 degrees and setting their trajectories. We call them the pathways. But then what we also did is that we started putting together non-state, meaning businesses and some national governments, all towards net zero by 2050, and that was part of the seeds that we started then irrigated and cultivated with Nigel during these last 2 years. And now all the attention is on COP26. So, Nigel, what is at stake when it comes to COP26?
Well, I mean, as you say, Gonzalo, the scientists have given us a very clear picture of what's at stake and what we have to do. And the latest IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change, has been described as a code red, a last warning sign for humanity before we go beyond tipping points that we'll never be able to come back from. And I think in many ways, the good news is the science is very clear, and we're experiencing it everywhere. Everywhere is experiencing droughts, floods, extreme heats that have never been experienced before, right, or much more frequently. So it feels like much more of a problem here now, rather than somewhere else in 20 years' time. What's at stake is that the current trajectory that the world is on is disastrous. The latest summary says that instead of that 50% reduction, which Gonzalo talks about, if you add up all of the plans of all of the governments of the world, we're going to increase by 16% by 2030. Now, the good news is that we think there's a lot more momentum, particularly in the private sector, and that's what we're really focusing on. But it has to, at some point, translate into policy because, there's private sector can't run too far ahead of policy. We all know that. And so what's at stake in Glasgow is fundamentally, are the world leaders going to come together? And by the world leaders, I mean, yes, leaders of governments, but also leaders of businesses and investors and cities, all those of us who have real agency to change direction. Will the world leaders come together and put us on track to halving emissions by 2030, or at least get close enough to it so that in the next 2 or 3 years, as we continue to set more ambitious targets and continue to invest and innovate, we can get on track? And the reason that Glasgow is really important is it's the first real test of a mechanism which was created in Paris. We call it the ratchet mechanism, a ratchet where you can increase ambition but not decrease it. So you can only go more ambitious. Paris said, and every country agreed, that every 5 years, every country will come back with a more ambitious plan. Many countries have, but some of the big G20 countries have not, and even some of the countries who have, they haven't really increased the ambition, or certainly not enough. So Glasgow's a real opportunity for those remaining countries to step up, also to fulfill some promises, particularly on climate finance, which were made in 2009, that haven't been met. But the other thing that is at stake in Glasgow is our confidence in ourselves, the belief that we, the humans alive today, have the ability to make this dramatic transformation. And a lot of that is about, do we believe that we have the businesses and the engineers who can create the innovations and the investors and business leaders who can invest in them to take them to scale fast enough? And the UK presidency has been very clear that this COP is not just about what governments are doing, but also about what the private sector and local governments are doing. And so for the first time, the summit has been organised to bring the real economy front and centre. So every day in Glasgow has a real economy theme: finance, transport, buildings, food, the oceans, resilience, so that it makes it much easier for us to organise the conversation and to demonstrate the momentum in those real economy sectors. So I think that the stakes are very high. Can we commit to enough action to show that we have confidence in ourselves to continue to innovate and accelerate change to deliver the resilient net zero world that the science requires that we deliver? Just to turn that all into economic terms for a business audience, the estimates are that on the current track, the world economy will be about 20% smaller in 2050 than if we invest in a net zero by 2050 track, which has led the leading economist of climate change, Nick Stern, to say that this green transformation is the only growth story of the 21st century. So you don't have to take a moral or an environmental or an intergenerational view on this. You can just take a straightforward economic view. We think you should take all of those and an economic view. The world economy will be 20% bigger in 2050 if we tackle this problem and turn the challenges into opportunities than if we continue on the current trajectory. So Gonzalo, tell us a little bit about what, in more detail, success looks like in Glasgow on the basis of that challenge.
Well, definitely first thing to be said is that Glasgow and this particular year is absolutely critical. We will definitely remember 2021 as the year where we had so many concrete opportunities, and in that sense, it's so clear where stakeholders are now looking to judge the success of Glasgow, being the first one, the near-term commitments with a focus on what's needed by 2030, meaning that we spoke a lot about the 2050 target. While most of the success of any kind of 2050 goal is going to be relying on what we do in these 5 to 10 years, right? So anything that is related on what business and other non-state actors are capable of doing on contributing their fair share on halving emission in the next 9 years. So please put that in your brain immediately. It's about halving the emissions of the world and of every single institution, whether it's a country, a business, a city, an investor, all of us need to have our emissions in the next 9 years. That's what science is asking us to do immediately. And succeeding in also achieving more of those breakthrough actions that are needed in every sector on the path to net zero, with very concrete evidence of near-term action from critical numbers of the real economy actors. That's why we're not only focused on what is happening globally and how can we achieve a net zero and resilient world by 2050, but very particularly on what each sector, and then to each of you listening to us, for your sector, there is a map. And if there is not a written map yet, there is somebody writing it. And you better get connected to it and hopefully anticipate in that map, because that's where you can guarantee on reaching all of those opportunities that Nigel was referring to. Another critical element is mobilizing the capital that is needed. And in that sense, we of course all know that we need countries to deliver on the promise of Paris and then be able to deploy the $100 billion that were promised by government, but then move to the trillions that are needed to transform all developing countries and emerging as well as also advanced economies. The challenge that we have in front of us is massive. It will require a lot of financial resources, but then of course it will create, as Nigel said very properly, so much more when it comes to the opportunities. That's valid not only for all of the mitigation actions, but also for those that are related to adaptation and building resilience. Then one element that is definitely critical and that I have no doubt will be determinative for the success of Glasgow is that the fossil fuels will phase out, with a focus on whether the world is serious about consigning coal to history, and stakeholders are looking for all of the evidence that finance is supporting that transition, and we have seen that even in the previous and last weeks regarding, for example, what Xi Jinping from China said at the United Nations General Assembly. Like, the world has changed so rapidly in the last 2 years in that sense, so we can kind of guarantee that that will be centered in the agenda and centered in what will define success from Glasgow. And then, of course, all of you probably are thinking the same. When it comes to the rules, the regulations, all the architecture that is required for all of these changes need to be in place to deliver the action that is needed, not only from the states, but also from the non-state actors. The rules have to update, and we need, of course, many of those rules to be, in some cases, finished and signed out when it comes to rules that are related to the Paris Agreement, but then also rules that are related to certain sectors, rules that are related to the financial mechanisms. But then it's also important that we clarify that this is not only about mitigation and reducing the emissions. We need to ensure that there is a proper plan in place to build climate resilience for at least 4 billion people of the most vulnerable. Those that are the less responsible of creating this crisis are now the ones that are hardest hit by the climate shocks. And we need them not only to survive the crisis, but thrive despite of it. So vulnerable countries and communities have unique needs, and COP26 need to be seen as a global moment of solidarity that brings all voices together, and hopefully one that will also learn from everything that had happened around COVID. But this success, we know, will only be possible through radical collaboration and ambitious multilateralism. We definitely need an all-of-society approach to make this possible, and in that sense, we expect also that we are capable of delivering some potential solutions or some recipes for what the Secretary General of the United Nations normally says, that it refers to as the new multi-stakeholder inclusive multilateralism. So Nigel, we've spoken a lot about what we need to see for COP26 to be a success, but perhaps we should say more about what we're doing to contribute to this success and what we have been working quite hard with a brilliant group of extraordinary people supporting us for the last 2 years.
Well, as you say, it's not so much you and me, it's an amazing team, and then hundreds of organizations working with the business and investor community, working with cities. And really, we've organized our work. Gonzalo's described the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: reducing emissions to zero, financing the transition, and taking care that lives and livelihoods are resilient in the face of the now real climate shocks that are already here and will get worse. So we've organized our work against those 3 pillars. The first one we call the race to zero. And that's about getting as many businesses and cities and others to commit in a really robust way to getting to zero. So not just the 2050 target, but as Gonzalo described, a very clear plan for the next 10 years or next 9 years, what actions are going to be taken, and a commitment to publishing progress so that organizations can be held accountable. We have over 6,000 businesses, cities, universities already committed. I think about 4,500 businesses, and many more every week. It's really ramping up. So if you haven't done that yet, it's still time to join the race to zero until the end of COP, and the race will keep running. We're just running the first lap, really. We put a lot of effort into the credibility of targets. We could talk a lot about that, but just know that there is a danger of greenwashing when people make big targets. So the race to zero is designed to eliminate greenwashing. So anyone in the race to zero has made a very robust and credible commitment. And then we really focus on breakthroughs, and we talk about 2 types of breakthrough in a sector. The first is the ambition breakthrough, when we get 20% of the main actors, so we know that the whole sector is really starting to change. And then the outcome breakthrough, like a real economy point in 2030. We launched those in January based on the pathways that we've published that Gonzalo talked about, the 1.5 degree pathways that he pioneered and that we've continued to improve. And we said we were aiming to get to 10 of those sectors reach the ambition tipping point by Glasgow. We've already got to 15, and we'll aim to get to all of the rest of them by this time next year. And then the power of the pathways is that they create a coordinated way of the whole sector moving, and then the breakthrough outcome just identifies that particular point, whether it's 40 million tons of green steel, or 10% of sustainable aviation fuel in 2030, or 26 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolysis in 2026, to get down to $2 a kilogram. So very specific economic measurable deliverables in terms of cost or in terms of capacity. And of course, all of that is going to need finance. So the second pillar, we've organised, working with the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, into the Glasgow Finance Alliance for net zero. And again, we've used the Race to Zero standard to make sure all those commitments are robust. We have asset owners, like pension funds, asset managers, banks, insurers, all in, over 250 finance sector firms, with between them over $90 trillion of assets in their portfolios or their balance sheets, all committed to halving emissions by 2030 and zero emissions by 2050. The key there, of course, is that means, for example, I was in Korea recently. Shinhan, the biggest bank in Korea, will not lend any money to new coal mining or coal burning. And any existing loans, when they reach their term, they will not refinance. So very specifically shifting, and of course, instead they're moving towards financing renewable energy and green steel and green hydrogen projects, because the amount of capital to deploy is, of course, still the same. So GFANZ, as well as increasing the number of trillions committed, is working on some of those cross-sectoral issues like what is the finance need to get to the green steel breakthrough or the green shipping breakthrough, and what's the role of different actors like banks, ratings agencies, insurers, and asset managers. And finally, and in a way, in some ways, most importantly to global solidarity is the work on resilience, the race to resilience, which aims to make the lives and livelihoods of 4 billion people more resilient by 2030. And that's also at the heart of the economic figure I talked about. People living lives that are not resilient, smallholder farmers who don't have insurance or access to inputs, city dwellers who might have their homes washed away in a flood, they cannot contribute to the global economic growth, which is that 20% uplift that I talked about if we follow this resilient net zero path. So that's how we're organizing. And Gonzalo, maybe you could focus further by talking about what businesses can do to join these efforts, especially the race to zero.
Sure. Well, race to zero, as you can imagine, requires the levels of credibility, accountability, and traceability that Nigel just referred to. So we're talking about the golden standard when it comes to net zero commitments. And we have done all of it working in what we refer to as radical collaboration with the strongest and most relevant network of partners. So Race to Zero, understand it as an umbrella campaign bringing together the most important leading initiatives and coalitions from all around the world, and in this case, particularly when it comes to businesses. So those partner initiatives, they act as secretariats through which individual organizations can join, right? So you cannot join directly, let's say as a company, directly connecting Nigel and I or our team. Is through one of these partners. And let me refer to some of them. So you have to apply to one of the initiatives, for example, at the United Nations Global Compact. In Spanish would say El Pacto Global de las Naciones Unidas. They have this initiative called Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees. So you connect to the Global Compact, and that will take you to sign the agreement at the Business Ambition for 1.5. We have, and that is about a 2050 target. Then when it comes to companies committing to a 2040 target, we have this initiative called the Climate Pledge. And the Climate Pledge that was launched by Amazon and Global Optimism, they have this pledge that will take you to a commitment to 2040. And then, for example, the B Corp community, Empresas B, we have the B Corp Climate Collective putting together commitments towards 2030. And then when it comes to, for example, SMEs like pymes, you have a commitment directly developed by the International Chamber of Commerce and Women Business, an exponential roadmap. And then we have some others that are more tailored for certain sectors. But the importance here is that you apply through one of these partner initiatives, and we're trying to make it as credible, as serious, as also easy for all of you to join. It's really easy when it comes to, if you're serious, if you want to follow science, if you understand that this is something critical, then you're more than welcome to join. In order to meet this robust criteria that Nigel mentioned, companies first need to set science-based targets, and not only thinking about 2050 or 2040, it's about interim targets as well, validated by science, and we're talking about the most robust and credible structure around science-based target initiatives for business. Then you have to submit a clear plan, also validated by science, and you have a moment, like a period of time when you can validate that plan. Then you have to take immediate action. And finally, you have to report annually. That's what we call the 4 Ps: pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. Then when it comes to race to resilience, there are a few options for businesses that are wanting to join the race to resilience. The first option is to identify a current partner initiative that is already in the race to resilience that you can take part and join that initiative, right? That's a very natural option. Find take a look about the several initiatives that we have in the race, and maybe that's one that can make sense to you and join. Then to become a business member of an initiative, you must also meet the minimum criteria. That is, again, similar to the Race to Zero. You have to pledge to make vulnerable communities resilient in the face of increased physical risk associated with climate change by 2030. Remember that this is about building the resilience of 4 billion people in this decade up to 2030. Then second, you have to plan how to take action toward this commitment with interim targets and concrete milestones. Then fourth P, you have to take immediate action on that plan. You have to proceed. And then finally, you have to commit to publicly report progress against both the interim and the long-term target, at least annually. So to make the campaign as inclusive and accessible as possible, business can also partner with the campaign to deliver standalone actions to advance the campaign's 2030 goal. So all of these transformative actions include, of course, increasing the quantity and quality of finance and investment for climate resilience, the capacity building, and creating infrastructure and technological innovations. That is something that most of the time in our minds was like, we left that for the governments to deliver. And now it's a moment for all businesses, all investors to understand that that's not only a major opportunity, that's also a moral duty that we have in terms of creating the conditions for the whole humanity to be resilient to the climate shocks. So same as the Race to Zero, all pledge actions are assessed and approved by an expert peer review group. In the case of Race to Zero, that expert peer review group is led by the Oxford University. In the UK, when it comes to Race to Resilience, the expert peer review group is led by the CR2 Center at the Universidad de Chile in our country. So also a great example of a legacy coming from this agenda. So you can also, of course, all the time use your voice to build the case for climate adaptation and the need for corporate action to build resilience. We are here offering several opportunities, whether you're focused on adaptation and resilience, as I've just explained, whether it's about really committed to developing that net zero world that we require and reducing our emissions and sequestering more carbon and restoring nature, or whether it's about helping to finance the transition or transitioning the financial mechanisms. So Nigel, you want to say a few final words?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to join the race. We've made it very easy to join. Like, it's easy to join the marathon. You just send off your check and you join. It's hard to run. We know that. But the whole world is running this race. So if you don't start running soon, you end up behind, and it becomes very difficult to catch up because the race goes faster and faster and faster. And there's no medals for anyone who's not in the race. So I'd encourage you all to join these 3 races. And finally, I'd say, back to my earlier points, I think Chile has shown real leadership in the world on climate change through its presidency of COP25. And Gonzalo has brought the dynamism of the Chilean private sector to the world's attention through his championing of your work all around the world. I see it every day. And that's going to come to an end in Glasgow. It'll be the end of the Chilean presidency. It'll be the end of Gonzalo's time as one of the high-level champions. He'll hand over to someone from an African country who I'll work with next year. And on the last big event in Glasgow, on the second Thursday, November the 11th, we'll celebrate all the momentum in the real economy in these 3 races. And I would love for there to be a very, very loud and proud group of Chilean businesses represented by Gonzalo and Chilean ministers on that last day to end the Chilean presidency with a demonstration of global leadership from the private sector in understanding the science, understanding the risks, understanding the opportunities, and taking the leadership steps to turn those opportunities into innovation, investments, and action. So I look forward to many of you who've already joined and telling your stories, but those who haven't joined, 4 weeks to Glasgow. It's very easy to join, and you will have to run the race anyway, so get in now, and let's celebrate together on November the 11th.
So thanks so much, my dear friend. I will turn back to Spanish to close my intervention here again. So, le hablo ahora a todos mis compatriotas, empresarios, empresarias del Biobío y de todo Chile, de donde nos estén escuchando. Lo primero que les quiero transmitir, en base a lo que ya han escuchado, es que esta es una agenda absoluta y completamente inevitable. No intentemos tapar el sol con un dedo. No hay forma de evitar esta transición, y mientras más rápido lo hagamos, mejor va a ser, y más rápido vamos a entrar en esta ruta fabulosa de oportunidades que yo creo que muchos de nosotros la estamos viendo. Estamos viendo cómo se nos presenta un mundo de energía renovable y de hidrógeno verde y de electromovilidad y de agricultura que aporta sustentabilidad a través de los alimentos. Tenemos millones de oportunidades en nuestras manos y tenemos la necesidad, la oportunidad y el deber moral de convertir a Chile efectivamente en una potencia en materia de desarrollo sostenible. Ahora, quiero empatizar con quienes nos estén escuchando y que puedan sentir que todo lo que le hemos dicho es abrumador. Es abrumador hablar de una crisis existencial como la que estamos viviendo, sí. Es abrumador recibir las noticias que vemos por televisión, es abrumador recibir la evidencia que nos muestra la ciencia. Es abrumador sobre todo relacionarse con un público más joven que ve con frustración, con inquietud, con pánico y con angustia lo que se les puede estar viniendo por delante. Empatizo con quienes de ustedes pueden estar incluso pensando en cómo bloquear esto. ¿Cómo hago para que lo que me dijeron estos dos tipos no exista, no sea verdad? Es un poco como cuando vamos al médico y nos dan una mala noticia respecto de nuestra salud. La primera motivación puede ser ir a buscar una segunda opinión. Lamento decirles que aquí no hay una segunda opinión en términos de tenemos poco nivel de alineamiento científico global en algo como lo tenemos en materia climática, y la evidencia de la naturaleza habla por sí sola. Lo que quiero que se queden es con que esta angustia que pueden sentir, ustedes la pueden transformar inmediatamente en ese entusiasmo que nos mueve en el mundo empresarial cuando estamos comprometidos a resolver problemas, porque no debiera existir ninguna empresa en el mundo que no esté en el mercado sino para resolver un problema. Bueno, hoy no existe un problema más importante que este, porque este es el problema que condiciona a todos los demás. Y por lo tanto la invitación es que demos un paso al frente y enfrentemos la oportunidad que quizás nadie nunca más tuvo a nivel histórico de resolver un problema no solo para esta generación, sino que también para todas las generaciones que vienen por delante, y hacerlo como lo hacemos quienes entendemos el poder de la innovación, el poder del desarrollo de la tecnología, el poder de las relaciones humanas, el poder del talento. Lo hacemos con alegría y con la capacidad de que eso se refleje en la satisfacción de cerrar un muy buen mes, cerrar un muy buen año. Compatriotas que nos están escuchando, estando nosotros hoy en Dubái, qué ganas de que todos cerremos juntos un año 2021 que fue el año en que entendimos, el año en que nos comprometimos y el año en que dimos los primeros pasos decisivos. Muchas gracias.